The sound coming from inside the auditorium was muffled, but David could make out the words. They were in Akkadian, a dead language, but to him it was more alive and logical than the world outside. Outside, the only sound was the hum of the hallway lights and the security guard's deep voice. "This event is not for you, young man," said the man, his hand firmly on David's arm. The hand was large, the touch cold, and it sent a clear message that he did not belong there. David looked at the red, velvet rope blocking the entrance. Such a fragile barrier, yet so powerful. He wasn't trying to force his way in. He just stopped to listen, and his body, as it always did when he was focused, swayed slightly. A sway that, to the security guard, was the final seal of suspicious. A large black man acting strange at the door of an exclusive event. The equation in the security guard's mind was instant and cruel. From where in our country or the world are you watching us? Think of a door that was closed in your face. An opportunity denied not because of a lack of merit, but because of your appearance, your manner, who you are. Stay with us. Because the man who would be called to open that door was not a friend or a colleague, but the highest authority at that university, and the apology he made, live on camera, would become a landmark moment. Sign up, because this is a story about breaking down barriers, both velvet and invisible. David lived in a world of ancient texts. In his mind, he wasn't in the hallway of a modern university. He was in Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, deciphering clay tablets. Autism, for him, was a lens of absolute focus. It allowed his mind to dive into the complex rules of Sumerian grammar, to find patterns in hieroglyphs that others saw as mere drawings. Dead languages did not lie. They did not use sarcasm. Their rules were immutable. Their beauty lay in their logic. It was the opposite of the social world, a chaotic code he struggled to understand but rarely managed to decipher. But the world insisted on deciphering him, and always in the wrong way. The first thing they saw was his skin. He was a 6-foot-tall black man. In a society that programmed him to see men like him as a threat, his physical presence alone was a problem. When he walked through the university hallways, he felt the stares, the purses being held tighter, the space opening up around him. The second thing they noticed was his mannerisms. When he was anxious or deeply focused, he would tap his fingers rhythmically on his leg or sway his body. It was his stimming, his way of regulating a nervous system constantly bombarded by stimuli. To others, however, his swaying was nervousness, suspicious behavior. His difficulty with eye contact was arrogance or dishonesty. His direct speech, without social niceties, was rudeness. So the world saw him as a big, weird black man. The combination was dangerous. He felt like a complex, cuneiform text being read by illiterate people. They only saw the symbols on the surface, the scary shapes, and jumped to hasty and wrong conclusions. No one bothered to learn the language, to understand the deep history and knowledge that lay beneath. His outbursts were not out of anger, but out of deep exhaustion. The exhaustion of having to translate himself every day to a world that refused to learn his language, and of being constantly judged by the cover before even having a chance to show the contents of his book. David's academic journey was a steep climb, full of people trying to convince him to take an easier path. In high school, his guidance counselor looked at his transcript and saw average grades in subjects that required group interaction and perfect grades in history and Latin. "Have you thought about something more practical, David?" said the counselor, with a patronizing smile. "Maybe a technical course? Carpentry? You're big. You've got a knack for it." The suggestion was so absurd, so disconnected from his passion for philology, that David just remained silent. His hope of finding a guide was dashed. At university, the situation became more subtle but equally discouraging. In his first semester, a sociology professor criticized him for not participating in debates. David tried to explain that he preferred to formulate his thoughts in writing, but the professor saw his quietness as disinterest or inability. On another occasion, he handed in an assignment on the trade routes of ancient Babylon. The professor called him into his office, suspicious. "Did you write this yourself, David? The quality of the research is unexpected." The veiled accusation of plagiarism was an insult that left him speechless. The hope of being judged solely on his intellectual merit began to seem like a fantasy. The greatest false hope was a mentoring program for minority students. He was assigned a mentor, a graduate student in business administration who tried to give him tips on how to fit in and network. "You need to go to parties, play on the college team, be more outgoing," the mentor advised. He was trying to mold David into the corporate, successful man mold, completely ignoring that David's dream was not to close deals but to decipher Dead Sea Scrolls. Each of these encounters was a reminder that people did not want to help him be the best version of himself. They wanted to turn him into a more palatable version of themselves. His hope of finding a true academic home was eroded, leaving behind the feeling that he would always be a stranger in his own house of learning. The conflict at the auditorium door wasn't about one bad person. It was about a broken system. The security guard, a tired, middle-aged man with sore feet, wasn't a monster. He was following an invisible script, written by decades of social prejudice. In his mind, he was keeping order. The instructions were clear. The event was for academics and special guests. And David, in his society-shaped perception, did not fit into either of those categories. The large black man who made no eye contact and swayed his body set off all the alarms of his internalized prejudice. He wasn't stopping a brilliant student. He was stopping a potential problem. He was the ignorant cog in a much larger machine of exclusion. The event itself was part of the problem. Professor Miller's lecture, a renowned expert in Assyrian studies, was not open to all students, but to a select group of graduate students and faculty. It was an act of academic gatekeeping, the creation of an exclusive club that, intentionally or not, reinforced hierarchies and excluded those who did not fit the traditional mold of the academic. The very existence of a velvet barrier at the door was a symbol of this mentality, and there was David's internal conflict. At that moment, with the security guard's hand on his arm and the curious murmurs of passers-by, part of him wanted to give up. He wanted to turn around, go back to his small apartment, to the safe company of his books and his translations. It was easier. The academic world he loved so much in theory, in practice, demanded an energy he didn't have. The energy to constantly explain himself, justify himself, fight for the right to simply exist in a space. The desire to share his knowledge, to hear that lecture on the language he loved, was at war with the exhaustion of being who he was in a world that wasn't ready for him. For a moment, exhaustion almost won. While David stood frozen, fighting his internal battle, a figure hurried down the hallway. It was Dr. Isabelle Dubois, a tenured professor of ancient history, a woman in her 60s with a sharp gaze and a reputation for being brilliant and relentless. She was late for her lecture. Upon seeing the scene, the security guard holding one of her students by the arm at the door, she frowned. She recognized David immediately. She also recognized the subtle sway of his body, which she had learned to interpret not as nervousness, but as a sign of deep concentration or anxiety. She understood the scene in a split second. It wasn't a security issue. It was a problem of ignorance. What exactly is going on here? Her voice cut through the air, calm but with a steely edge. The security guard turned, surprised. "Dr. Dubois, this young man was trying to get in, ma'am. The event is private." "This young man," she said, stepping closer and placing herself between the K's, security guard and David, "is called David. He is my student, and with all due respect, he probably understands more about Akkadian than half the people in there. Let go of his arm. Now." The authority in her voice was unquestionable. The security guard, suddenly unsure of himself, let go of David's arm. I didn't know, ma'am. He was acting strange." "What you consider strange," Dr. Dubois replied, her eyes fixed on his, "I consider the sign of a brilliant mind at work. Your failure to distinguish between the two is the real problem here." She turned to David, her expression softening. "Are you okay, David?" He just nodded, still processing. The turnaround wasn't a shout. It was the precise, surgical intervention of someone who had the power to see beyond the surface and the courage to use her authority to defend the truth. The velvet barrier was still there, but the barrier of ignorance had just been torn down. Dr. Dubois' fierce defense did not come out of nowhere. It was forged over a semester of small victories that revealed David's exceptional mind. The first was in a graduate class on the Neo-Babylonian Empire that David had obtained special permission to attend. Dr. Dubois quoted a standard translation of an inscription by Nebuchadnezzar II. From the back of the room, David's voice rang out for the first time. "Excuse me, doctor, but the translation of Esagila as temple is simplistic. The etymology suggests the house that raises its head, which implies a cosmological function, not just a religious one." A shocked silence fell over the room. Dr. Dubois stared at him, skeptical. The following week, she began class with an apology. "I have thoroughly researched Mr. David's observation, and he is absolutely correct." It was the first time anyone in a position of power had publicly validated his knowledge. Then came the end of semester assignment. While other students wrote predictable analyses, David turned in a 40-page essay tracing the evolution of a single cuneiform symbol through 3 millennia and 4 different civilizations, proving a linguistic connection that most scholars considered non-existent. The work was not only well-researched, it was genius in its conception. Dr. Dubois read it 3 times, each time more amazed. She called him into her office and, instead of discussing grades, spent 2 hours talking to him about the implications of his research. It was the most stimulating academic conversation she had had in years. She saw how he lit up when he talked about his passion, how the social world disappeared and only the purity of knowledge mattered. These were the quiet victories, fought in libraries and classrooms, that made her realize that David wasn't just a student, he was a colleague, and she wouldn't let anyone bar a colleague from entering. After resolving the situation in the hallway and ensuring that David entered the auditorium, Dr. Dubois couldn't concentrate on the lecture. A cold, lucid fury consumed her. She looked around at her colleagues, the professors and graduate students in their tweed suits, and saw the hypocrisy of that environment. They prided themselves on their pursuit of truth, their objectivity, their being at the forefront of human thought. What a joke. She reflected on the university as an institution, a place that claimed to be a meritocracy, but in practice was a minefield of prejudice. How many Davids had been filtered out by the system before they even reached the auditorium door? How many brilliant minds had been discarded because they didn't look, talk, or act as expected? The image of the security guard, an ordinary man merely enforcing society's prejudices, was almost forgivable. The real blame, she thought, lay with them, with academia, for creating an environment so exclusive and so blind that one of its most promising talents could be mistaken for a threat. Her feeling of anger was mixed with a deep sense of responsibility. She had no children, but she felt an almost maternal protective instinct toward David. Not to protect the fragile person, but the brilliant mind, to protect the gift he possessed. It wasn't enough to correct the injustice in the hallway. The root of the problem had to be addressed. A public gesture was needed, an institutional acknowledgement of the failure. At that moment, she decided she would not write an email or fill out a complaint form. She would go straight to the top. She would go to the dean's office, and she would not leave until justice was more than a word in a philosophy book, until it became a visible and resonant action. Professor Miller's lecture was abruptly interrupted. The side door of the stage opened and Dean Alves, the highest authority at the university, walked up to the podium. He was a man known for his calm demeanor and rare appearances. His unexpected presence caused an immediate murmur in the audience. At his side, with a determined expression, stood Dr. Dubois. The dean picked up the microphone. The room fell silent. "Good evening," he began, his firm, deep voice echoing through the auditorium. "I apologize to Professor Miller for this interruption, but a matter of the utmost importance requires our immediate attention. Something happened at the door of this auditorium tonight that represents a profound failure of our institution." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience until they found David, who was sitting in the back row next to Dr. Dubois. Tonight, one of our most promising students of ancient history, Mr. David, was barred from entering this event. He was prevented from attending a lecture on the subject he loves and has mastered, and the reason he was barred is unacceptable. The dean took a deep breath. "We have been guilty of an act that shames everything a university should stand for. We have been guilty of an act of racism and ableism, our security, following prejudices that unfortunately still exist in our society, and, we must admit, in our institution, judged a man by the color of his skin and his manner, and considered him a threat. There is no excuse for this." He looked directly at David. "David, On behalf of this entire university, the faculty, staff, and students, I offer you my deepest and most sincere apologies. The door that was closed to you today will be the door that we will make sure to keep open for you, and for everyone like you from now on. You are not just welcome here, you belong here. He put down the dear microphone. No one applauded. The silence was heavy, dense, full of reflection. David did not stand up. He just raised his head and nodded once to the dean, a gesture of quiet dignity that was more powerful than any speech. At that moment, victory was not loud. It was the truth, spoken aloud, clearing the air and promising a future where knowledge would be the only key needed to open any door. Knowledge has no color, creed, or barrier. Doors are created by men, and by men they must be torn down. True education is not about what we know, but how willing we are to unlearn our own prejudices. If this story made you think, if it outraged and inspired you, join us. Like, comment, and subscribe. But more than that, the next time you see a door closing on someone, be the person who has the courage to ask why. Be the person who opens the door.